It was supposed to be a reunion, one that would bring peace after months of separation. For Sergeant James Harris, the end of his deployment meant coming back to his family, his home, and the life he had fought so hard to protect. But nothing could prepare him for the sight that awaited him when he walked through that door. He had spent months overseas, serving in dangerous missions, each day filled with uncertainty. But now it was supposed to be different. Now he was heading home to his wife, to the woman he had sworn to love and protect. They had been high school sweethearts. Their love story is one for the books. They promised each other that no matter the distance, their bond would never break. As he stood outside the door, his hand gripping the doorknob, a strange sense of unease settled over him. He could hear nothing on the other side, no sound of the television, no quiet conversations, just the hum of silence that felt wrong. He opened the door slowly, the familiar creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness. Then he saw it. There in the dim light of their bedroom was his wife, Sarah, in bed with another man. The shock hit him like a slap in the face, his heart pounding in his chest. His world, which had been carefully built on trust and love, suddenly shattered in an instant. He stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on the scene before him. Sarah, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, was in the arms of another man. The betrayal was palpable. The silence was suffocating. James blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening, but his mind couldn't process it fast enough. The man in the bed was no stranger. He knew him. It was Greg, his best friend, the man who had stood by his side through thick and thin, who had been like a brother to him. How could this happen? Why hadn't he seen it coming? The room felt colder now. His military training kicked in, but there was nothing that could prepare him for this. He had always prided himself on keeping control, on maintaining discipline. But in this moment, his world was falling apart. As the realization settled in, so did the rage. How could they do this to him? To their family? To the life they had built together? The anger burned through him, but it was more than just betrayal. It was a deep, personal violation. It was a question of loyalty, a question of trust, and those questions had no easy answers. James stepped further into the room, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. Sarah's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of guilt. But it was quickly replaced by something else, fear. She knew what was coming. In that moment, the man who had once been a soldier in the field, used to violence and conflict, was now facing a battle of his own. The betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a knife to the heart. He didn't know what to do or what he was capable of, but he knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same. What happened next shocked everyone who knew them. This wasn't just an act of passion. This wasn't a simple mistake. The events that followed were calculated, deliberate, an irreversible chain of actions that no one could have predicted. But what led James to make the decisions he did that night? Was it the heat of the moment, a reaction to the betrayal? Or was there something more beneath the surface, something darker that had been brewing all along? The answers would come, but the question remained. Was this an act of revenge, or was this something far more premeditated? Before the betrayal, before the devastation that would turn James Harris's world upside down, there was nothing out of the ordinary. From the outside, their life together seemed perfect. James, a dedicated soldier, had spent years serving his country, and Sarah, his wife, had always supported him. They were the picture of stability, both in their marriage and in their community. To those around them, they were an ideal couple, partners in love, life, and family. But the perfect life they had built together was about to crumble in an instant. James had enlisted right after high school, following a long family tradition of military service. He was used to being away from home, accustomed to the long deployments and the strain they put on relationships. But through it all, Sarah had been his rock, his one constant. They had built a life around each other, buying a house, starting a family, making memories together. Their bond, forged over the years, was unshakable in James's eyes. At least that's what he thought. The months apart had been hard on both of them, but James had faith that their love would withstand the distance. They spoke on the phone as often as they could, and he would write her letters whenever he could find time. The anticipation of returning home to her was something he clung to during the toughest days of his deployment. Sarah, too, would send him thoughtful care packages and warm messages, always telling him how much she missed him, how excited she was for his return. When the time finally came for James to return home, he couldn't wait to be reunited with his wife. He had been counting the days, but as he boarded the plane back to the States, he had no idea that the homecoming he had imagined for so long would turn into a nightmare. It was a warm evening when James arrived back at his house. The air was thick with anticipation as he stepped off the plane, eager to see Sarah and feel the comfort of home. He had imagined this moment so many times, hugging her, kissing her, and holding her close after such a long separation. But what awaited him at home wasn't the joyful reunion he had envisioned. He arrived at their home around dusk. The porch light was on, the front door slightly ajar, and the faint sound of the television playing inside. The neighborhood was quiet as it always was. James paused for a moment, his hand on the door handle, taking in the silence. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was just the exhaustion from the long flight or the strain of the months apart. But he pushed the feeling aside and walked inside. What he saw next would haunt him forever. There, in their bed, was Sarah. But she wasn't alone. In the bed beside her, in the intimate space that was supposed to be shared only between them, was another man. James froze in the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The scene before him was a blur. Sarah, in the arms of another man, her body pressed up against him in a way that James had never seen before. It was as though his entire world had stopped in that instant. The man lying next to Sarah was someone James recognized all too well, his best friend, Greg. The man who had been by his side through thick and thin, the man who had been like a brother to him. The betrayal cut deeper than anything James could have imagined. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a betrayal of the highest order. The man he trusted most had slept with his wife. And as if that wasn't enough, the woman he had loved and built a life with had been the one to let it happen. For a moment, James couldn't move. He just stood there, staring at the two of them, his mind trying to wrap itself around the impossibility of the situation. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling with a mix of shock and anger. The room, once a place of love and comfort, felt cold and foreign. The warmth he had always felt in this home was gone, replaced by the bitter sting of betrayal. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling with fear. She sat up quickly, pulling the blanket over herself in a futile attempt to cover up her actions. Her eyes widened as she saw James standing there, his face a mixture of confusion, hurt, and rage. "James, I didn't mean for this to happen," Sarah said, her voice faltering. But the words sounded empty. What was there to say? What could she possibly say to explain this? Greg, on the other hand, remained silent. He sat up slowly, his eyes avoiding James's gaze, knowing full well that the situation couldn't be salvaged. He was caught. There was no denying what had just happened. James's mind raced. He had so many questions, but there were no answers. Why? How could this happen? How could the woman he loved betray him in this way? And why did Greg, someone who was supposed to be his closest friend, participate in the betrayal? The anger that had been building inside him began to surface, and the flood of emotions felt overwhelming. The betrayal was like a knife to his heart, and the pain was unbearable. He took a step forward, his fists clenched, his body trembling with anger. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, his voice breaking as the weight of the situation hit him fully. Sarah, still trying to find the right words, reached out to him. "James, please, I don't know how to explain." But before she could finish, James cut her off. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is beyond anything I could have imagined." As the reality of the situation set in, James couldn't stand there any longer. The pain was too much. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his mind racing with anger, betrayal, and confusion. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to make sense of everything that had just been destroyed. But the answers would come, and the consequences of this moment would change everything. James had known Greg for years. They had shared countless laughs, late-night conversations, and even fought side by side in dangerous situations. Greg had been the brother James never had. The bond they shared had always been built on loyalty and respect, two things that now felt completely shattered in a single instant. He took a step forward, his body moving almost instinctively. He felt the anger building inside him, a wave of emotion he couldn't suppress. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what was happening. His mind screamed at him to stop, to leave, to walk away from this nightmare. But the betrayal was too much. He couldn't just turn around and pretend everything was fine. "James, Sarah started, her voice trembling, but James didn't want to hear it. There were no words that could make this better, no explanation that could heal the wound she had just inflicted. He looked at her, at the woman he had promised to love and protect, and found that he didn't recognize her anymore. His fists clenched involuntarily, and before he knew it, he was standing in front of Greg, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had stolen from him the one thing that had always been his trust. And without warning, James's emotions exploded. His hand shot out, grabbing Greg by the collar and pulling him up out of the bed. There was no thinking, no consideration of what was right or wrong. All that mattered in that moment was the betrayal. He needed to do something, anything, to make the pain go away. Greg tried to push James off, but he was no match for the raw fury that had taken over him. James shoved him back down onto the bed, the anger in his chest burning hot and uncontrollable. He could feel his pulse racing, his whole body alive with a need to do something, to release this torment inside him. "How could you do this to me?" James shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "How could you do this to us?" Sarah scrambled to sit up, her face a mask of guilt and fear. She reached out to James, but he was too far gone. There was no reaching him now. His trust had been shattered in an instant, and nothing she said would change that. His eyes were wild, his whole body trembling with the weight of the anger coursing through him. Greg, still trying to defend himself, muttered something about how it wasn't supposed to happen this way, how it wasn't planned. But his words fell on deaf ears. James was past listening. He wasn't looking for answers. There were no answers that would make this right. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was acting purely out of the pain and rage that had flooded his system. He had been humiliated in the worst possible way, and now he wanted to hurt, to make them understand the depth of his suffering. The confrontation grew chaotic, their bodies tumbling on the floor, pushing and pulling in the heat of the moment. But in the back of his mind, James knew this was wrong. He knew he wasn't in control anymore. But the anger had clouded everything. Clouded his judgment, clouded his ability to see clearly. His hands were shaking, his breath was ragged, but all he could feel was the overwhelming surge of betrayal and heartbreak. He felt betrayed by his best friend, by the woman he loved, and by himself for ever trusting them. Then, the rage began to subside, and in its place, something colder took root. The anger wasn't gone, but now there was a numbness that began to settle in. The reality of what had happened sank in fully. He had gone too far. What was happening was irreversible. The love, the trust, the bond they had shared, it was all gone now. And in its place, there was just an empty, aching void. James stopped for a moment, staring at the scene before him. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rage now started to fade, leaving him in the stark, sobering aftermath of what he had done. The silence in the room was deafening. It was as if time had stopped, and all he could do was look at the consequences of his actions. What had he done? How had things gone so horribly wrong? His body trembled not just from the physical exertion, but from the overwhelming realization that his life had changed in a way he could never take back. There was no going back from this. He stood there, staring at the lifeless scene before him, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should he stay? Should he call the police? Should he flee the scene and leave everything behind? His thoughts were disjointed, a blur of confusion and disbelief. But one thing was clear: his life, his marriage, everything he had known was shattered. And there was no undoing that. What do you think of James's reaction? Was his anger justified, or did he take it too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The first responders arrived at the scene in rapid succession, their sirens wailing in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. What was once a place of comfort and peace now felt like a crime scene. Officers poured out of their vehicles, securing the perimeter and making sure that no one, except for the investigators, could get close. The flashing lights bathed the house in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the driveway. The neighbors peeked through their windows, too shocked to do anything but watch. As they entered the house, the full scale of what had happened began to unfold. The scene was chaotic, almost unreal. The bedroom where this violent confrontation had taken place was still littered with broken furniture, upturned bed sheets, and shattered glass. The once serene and loving space now felt like a battleground. Blood stained the carpet, evidence of the brutality that had just occurred. The officers moved quickly, yet carefully, as they began to document the crime scene. Nothing could be left to chance. The first officer on the scene called it in over the radio. Suspect is military personnel. Scene secure for investigation. Requesting additional units and forensic support. The calmness in the officer's voice contrasted sharply with the panic and confusion that hung in the air. There was no doubt this was a serious crime. 2 people dead in a violent confrontation, and the prime suspect a soldier with military training. The officers knew they had to move quickly to gather as much evidence as possible before it was lost. This was going to be a high-profile case, and every step had to be documented. If you are enjoying this true crime story like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. This is one of the 115 true crime stories in this vault. Stay with us as we continue to bring you the most compelling and shocking true crime stories, one after the other. The forensic team arrived soon after, suited up and ready to search the house for any clues that could lead them to the truth. They entered the bedroom first, carefully surveying the scene. Every detail needed to be captured. Every piece of evidence could provide a vital piece of the puzzle. As the investigators worked, they noticed the chaos in the room. The overturned furniture, the bloodstains, the weapon lying discarded on the floor. It was clear that this had been no simple fight. This was something far darker. The first bit of concrete evidence came quickly. A gun, still warm to the touch, lay on the floor near the bed. It wasn't a handgun. This was a military-issued weapon, something James had access to as part of his training. It was immediately clear that this had not been a crime of passion. It was a crime of violence, a crime of betrayal. The gun would be dusted for fingerprints, and investigators would soon confirm that James's prints were on it. But the gun wasn't the only piece of evidence they were gathering. Sarah's phone, lying discarded on the bed, was quickly collected. The screen was cracked, but still functional. It was an important piece of the puzzle, because Sarah's phone could tell them more than just her last messages to James. It could reveal the extent of the affair and what, if anything, had been planned in advance. Back at the scene, detectives began going through the phone's contents. Text messages, emails, and call logs were examined carefully, and what they found left them shocked. For months, Sarah had been having an affair with Greg, James's best friend. But the affair wasn't as innocent as it seemed. Their texts told a different story. There were discussions of meetings, stolen moments, and secret rendezvous. There was even talk of a future, one where Sarah and Greg would be together without the complications of their past lives. These weren't just two people caught up in a moment of passion. This had been a calculated and deliberate betrayal. The two lovers had been planning this, and James had never suspected a thing. The forensic team began to document the blood splatter on the floor, taking careful notes about the trajectory and placement of the stains. From the evidence, they could tell that the violence had been sudden and brutal. The confrontation must have escalated quickly, with no warning. The investigators noted the position of the bodies and took meticulous measurements. In this room, the love that had once been shared between Sarah and James had been violently torn apart. It was clear now that this wasn't just a crime of passion. This was something deeper, something far more calculated. Sarah and Greg had been planning their future together, and James had been the unwitting obstacle to that future. His betrayal was the catalyst, but there was more to this story. The investigators knew they had to dig deeper into the backgrounds of the victims and the suspect. What had led Sarah to this point? And how far would Greg go to make his desires a reality? As the investigation continued, the detectives began to piece together the backgrounds of the victims. Sarah, a woman who had been married to James for nearly a decade, had become a stranger in the eyes of those who had once known her. She had been a dedicated wife, a loving mother, and a cherished member of their community. But now the truth came out. She had not only betrayed her husband, but had plotted with someone who had been in James's life for just as long. Greg, the man who had once been his best friend, had taken everything from him. Greg's identity became just as important to the investigation as Sarah's. It was clear that his involvement went beyond just the affair. There were financial records that suggested he and Sarah had been making plans to get rid of James, both figuratively and literally. They had been spending time together, making arrangements, and living a life outside of James's knowledge. Friends of Greg, once close to both him and James, were now in disbelief at his involvement in the affair and the murder. How could he do that to him? One of Greg's close friends asked, visibly shaken. They were brothers. How could he betray him like that? The shockwave of the betrayal rippled through both families. Sarah's family was in denial at first. They couldn't believe their daughter had been involved in something so devious. Her parents, who had always viewed her as a sweet, caring woman, were left to confront the harsh truth. The woman they knew was not the woman James had married. "I never thought she was capable of something like this," Sarah's mother said, tears streaming down her face. How could she betray him like that? He didn't deserve this. As the investigation unfolded, it was clear that this was not just a simple love triangle gone wrong. This was a meticulously planned betrayal, orchestrated by two people who had once been trusted friends and family. It was a crime that shook everyone involved to the core. No one had seen it coming, and the consequences were far-reaching. As the story began to spread throughout the town, the community was left asking the same question: how could something like this happen in their own backyard? What would you have done if you were in James's position? Do you think the affair was the main cause of the tragedy, or was something deeper at play here? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As the investigation deepened, the focus turned to James Harris, the soldier at the center of it all. His background, his emotions, and his actions were now under scrutiny. The question that loomed large in the minds of detectives and the community alike was simple: why did James do this? Was this an act of passion, driven by a moment of overwhelming rage? Or was there something more, something darker, that pushed him to the breaking point? To understand James's actions, investigators began to examine his past, searching for clues in his military career that might explain his response to the betrayal. He had been a soldier for almost a decade, having served in multiple overseas deployments. He was trained to face danger head-on, to keep calm in the most high-pressure situations. But what did that training do to him on a personal level? Could it have made him more prone to violence? James's military background was filled with both pride and trauma. He had been part of elite missions, often working in situations where danger was an everyday occurrence. For years, he had been hardened by the rigors of military life, facing enemies in foreign lands and pushing himself to the limits of his endurance. But now it seemed that the very discipline that had shaped him was about to come into question. Could the soldier who had served so honorably be the same man who had brutally attacked those he loved? In the months before the crime, James had been on a particularly long deployment. The strain of being away from his family for so long had clearly taken its toll on him. His letters and phone calls to Sarah had become more strained, filled with moments of doubt. The loneliness and isolation of deployment had only made him more dependent on the idea of coming home to Sarah, to the stability of their life together. But when that stability was ripped away, it was as though everything James had built for himself and his family fell apart in an instant. Had the stress of deployment, being away from home for so long, sharpened his emotional sensitivity? Had the months of separation made him more vulnerable to the idea of betrayal? Investigators couldn't ignore the fact that James had spent months in a combat zone, surrounded by violence, death, and loss. But could that explain the violence he brought home with him that night? As the investigators pieced together James's background, they also turned their attention to the physical evidence from the crime scene. The forensic team had a lot of work ahead of them, and each detail would be crucial in understanding the true nature of what had occurred in that bedroom. The autopsy reports would tell a harrowing story. Both victims, Sarah and Greg, had died of blunt force trauma and stabbing wounds. The injuries were brutal, a clear indication that the violence had escalated quickly. The medical examiner described the wounds as frenzied, suggesting that the killer had acted out of intense emotional rage. Sarah had multiple defensive wounds, showing that she had tried to fight back, but it was clear she never stood a chance. Greg had been killed almost instantly, a stab wound to the chest causing immediate death. Crime scene investigators also took meticulous measurements of the blood splatter in the room. The way the blood had been scattered across the floor and walls indicated that the confrontation had been chaotic and violent. They were able to piece together the sequence of events from the positioning of the bodies and the blood patterns. It was clear that James had been the one who caused the fatal wounds, as his fingerprints were found on the weapon that had been used. The investigators also found traces of DNA from both Sarah and Greg on James's clothes. It was clear from the evidence that James had been at the scene during the confrontation, and the crime had happened in a fit of anger and betrayal. The more the forensic team examined the evidence, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was a calculated response to months of emotional buildup. As the investigation continued, The detectives began to examine the motive behind the crime. Was this a moment of rage, a tragic outburst from a man whose life had been upended by betrayal? Or was this a carefully calculated act, the result of months, maybe years, of emotional and psychological strain? James had always been a man who prided himself on his discipline. But the more the investigators learned about his life, the more they realized that he had been living in an emotional turmoil for much of his military career. The long deployments, the isolation, the loneliness, these were not just external struggles, but internal ones. James's anger, which had once been directed at foreign enemies on the battlefield, had now turned inward. The woman he loved and the man he trusted most had betrayed him. And in the heat of that betrayal, something inside James snapped. James's confession, when it came, was simple yet chilling. He admitted to everything: his rage, his betrayal, his violence. He had been pushed beyond his limits, beyond anything he could handle. "I saw red," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I just wanted to make them understand, to make them feel what I felt." In those words, the true complexity of the crime became clear. This wasn't just a soldier who had lost control. This was a man who had been broken by the very people he trusted the most. And the result was tragic. In the wake of the horrific crime, the community was left to pick up the pieces. Sarah, once seen as a loving wife and mother, and Greg, once a trusted friend and confidant, were now both gone, victims of a betrayal that had spiraled out of control. The family, friends, and neighbors who had once known and loved them were left grappling with the shocking reality of their deaths. As the news spread, the impact was felt far beyond just the immediate family. Sarah's parents, who had raised her with love and care, were left to mourn the daughter they thought they knew. They spoke about her with heavy hearts, struggling to understand how such a loving and devoted woman could have made such a tragic decision. "We never saw it coming," Sarah's father said through tears. "She was always so kind, so caring. We just don't know what happened." Greg's family, too, was reeling from the news. To them, he was more than just a friend to James. He was family. He had grown up with James, sharing countless memories, triumphs, and struggles. To hear that Greg had been involved in this betrayal felt like a blow to the very foundation of their lives. "He was a good man," Greg's mother said, her voice breaking. "How could he do something like this to his best friend?" Both families were left to process the grief and loss of two loved ones, each taken in a way that none of them could have ever imagined. The community had also been shaken to its core. People who had known James, Sarah, and Greg for years struggled to reconcile the memories of the people they thought they knew with the truth of what had unfolded. This was a small town, and nothing like this had ever happened before. The church, which had always been a place of refuge and support for James and Sarah, was now a place of mourning. Parishioners who had once sat next to Sarah every Sunday were now forced to come to terms with the events that had unfolded in the very town they called home. The pastor spoke at the memorial service, sharing words of comfort for the grieving families. "This tragedy has torn us all apart," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We pray for healing, for understanding, and for peace for those who have been left behind." As the days turned into weeks, the community's grief remained. People who had once been friends, neighbors, and churchgoers now found themselves divided by the tragedy. How could they ever look at each other the same again? How could they reconcile their memories of these people with the violent end they had met? The bonds of friendship and family had been shattered, and the scars would remain long after the news cameras had gone. James's own family, too, was affected by the loss. His parents, who had always been proud of his military service, were devastated by what he had done. His mother, in particular, was heartbroken, not just by the loss of her son's innocence, but by the destruction of the family's once perfect image. I raised him to be strong, to fight for what's right, she said in an emotional interview. But I never imagined this. I never imagined he could hurt the ones he loved. The ripple effects of the tragedy reached every corner of the community. The streets that had once been filled with neighbors chatting, children playing, and families gathering now felt emptier, quieter. The town that had once been a symbol of peace and stability was now a place where trust had been broken and lives had been shattered. This tragedy has left a community shattered and families broken. What do you think could have prevented this heartbreaking event? Was there something deeper that led to this? Or was it the heat of the moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As the investigation drew to a close and the pieces of the tragic puzzle began to fall into place, the inevitable question arose. What would happen to James Harris? The soldier, whose life had been consumed by anger, betrayal, and loss, was now about to face the full weight of the law. His fate, and the fate of those involved in the crime, would soon be decided in a courtroom. The trial of James Harris was a highly anticipated event in the community. The courthouse was filled with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers. The tension in the air was thick, as everyone awaited the final judgment on this shocking case. James sat in the defendant's chair, his face grim, his eyes focused on the ground. The once proud soldier now found himself on the other side of the law, his actions under the microscope of the legal system. The prosecution presented a clear case against James. They argued that his actions were not just a response to betrayal, but a deliberate act of violence. The evidence was damning. The weapon, the fingerprints, the brutal nature of the crime. The prosecutor described the confrontation as a senseless act of rage, one that had been fueled by emotional distress, but ultimately led to the deaths of two innocent people. On the other side, the defense argued that James had been pushed to the brink. His military background, the long deployment, the emotional toll of being separated from his wife and family, it all contributed to his fragile state of mind. The defense claimed that James had acted out of intense emotional distress, that the betrayal he had experienced was too much for him to handle in that moment. They urged the jury to consider the psychological strain James had been under, hoping for a lesser charge based on these mitigating factors. As the trial progressed, both sides presented their cases, each seeking to sway the jury's opinion. The prosecution painted James as a man who had lost control and let his anger get the best of him. The defense, however, argued that James had been pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond his control, circumstances that no one could have predicted. The jury listened intently, weighing the evidence, the testimony, and the emotional toll of the case. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the entire room fell silent in anticipation. With a stern look, the judge spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, James Harris, guilty of second-degree murder." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The conviction meant that James would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but it also raised a question that would never fully be answered. The betrayal by his wife and best friend, the overwhelming anger, all of these factors played a role in the tragedy. But did that make his actions any less unforgivable? As the sentencing hearing began, James stood before the judge once more, his face now drained of emotion. His fate had been sealed. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison for the second-degree murder of his wife and her lover, Greg. The community, shocked by the outcome, began to grapple with the finality of the decision. In the days following the trial, the community was divided. Some believed James had been justified in his reaction, that the betrayal was too much for any person to handle. Others felt that no matter the circumstances, his actions could never be excused. The debate would continue for years as people wondered if there was a way this tragedy could have been avoided. James Harris's life has been forever altered by his actions. Was his response to the betrayal justified, or did he cross the line that can never be undone? What do you think about the final verdict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This tragic story shows just how far betrayal can go. The devastation left in its wake is undeniable. The lives of Sarah and Greg, taken far too soon, and the life of James, forever altered by his own actions. What began as a betrayal of trust escalated into a crime that no one could have predicted. But the question remains, were James's actions justified? Could he have found another way to deal with the overwhelming pain he felt? Or was his response, though emotional, a tragic result of his own internal struggles and the betrayal he had endured? This case leaves us questioning how far emotional turmoil can push a person and what happens when the pain of betrayal becomes too much to bear. It reminds us of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences when that trust is broken. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the soldier's reaction was understandable, or did he take it too far? Was there a better way to handle the situation, or was this tragedy inevitable? If you want more shocking true crime stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. This is one of the 115 true crime stories in this vault. Stay with us as we continue to bring you the most compelling and shocking true crime stories one after the other.